Okay, everybody, good afternoon. Everybody hear me okay?
Good afternoon. Hear you fine.
All right, thank you, Denny. So today I've got a lot of things to get through, which I don't like to say, but I want to make sure you have all the background that you need for your essay. And then as we are looking forward, I wanted to mention I've decided to push back the due date for the essay to just before class on Tuesday. So you'll see a new syllabus after class that will show on Moodle that the due date is now going to be the 27th at 2:30. So look for that. Do it when you feel like, but by that date, please. I'm going to go ahead and just do a screen share, and we're going to get started right away with the PowerPoint. And we'll talk in class about your essays, but also about the end of World War II for Japan next Tuesday in class. If you have questions from today, write them down, and then we can talk about them more in class on Tuesday. And then for tomorrow, don't forget that your thesis statements for your essays are still due for you. Bring those with you for discussion with Devin so that you'll have a good sort of launch for your essay. All right. So, all right, screen share. Boom. Boom. Okay. So today we're going to talk about 5 different aspects of Japan's 15-year war from 1931 to 1945. Oh, excuse me, I've got to make sure
great.
that. Get out of there. There we go. Okay. 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 Can you still hear me okay, everybody?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, thank you. All right, so am I in screen share? Okay, good. So today I'm talking about these 5 different aspects, right? So about Japan and China, it's big neighbor, and then Japan is in Asia as a whole, Japan and the Allied West, the US in particular, but we'll talk about other countries as well. The war in Japan on the home front, and then the end of the war. So we talked last class about Japan. They just kept sort of encroaching and bringing more and more military forces to protect their investments in the near Beijing in Tianjin. And as we talked about, Chiang Kai-shek had decided to stop opposing the Japanese in 33, but after 4 years, he decided he was done with that strategy, and he sent forces to confront the Japanese if they were to try and cross the Marco Polo Bridge and begin to invade Beijing. The fight results in the first actual battle of Japan's the second Sino-Japanese War, the war between Japan and China, Battle of Beijing, and Japan is victorious, and this leads to Japan's invasion of China in 37. This is again the bridge we talked about. From there, the troops of the Kwantung Army are going to grow in number. They're going to march south towards Shanghai after taking Beijing, and that will take a pretty short amount of time to get control over Shanghai, and then they will move down to the new capital of the Republican Chinese government in Nanjing. And Nanjing was taken very easily.
Professor?
People had actually, yes.
Some
Yes, Devin.
students are noting in the chat that they can't see your screen share.
let's see. Oh, okay. Let me see if I can resume share. Okay. How about now? Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, it's good now.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think
Okay,
we're good to go
thanks.
now.
So just going to keep moving forward here. Thank you for that, Devin. So when they got to Nanjing, people had actually largely abandoned the city in terms of the military. And so it was a very easy arrival and takeover for Nanjing. The Japanese thought that they would be able to take over Nanjing easily, but also to make a show of force and to prove that if China would stop resisting, Japan would stop being so violent. So the violence of the Japanese against Chinese civilians really sort of explodes in Nanjing in this effort to sort of put down all Chinese resistance. Japan realized that China was a big country and it would take a lot of resources to take over China. And if all of China kept resisting Japan, they would never be able to win. So in the course of 7 weeks, a massacre in Nanjing occurs in which the Japanese loot and destroy, but also rape a lot of civilian women. The death toll is still restored. There are debates about this, but we're talking about a good estimate is about 200,000 people who were killed, most of whom were Chinese civilians, probably some soldiers who had also abandoned their posts and were hiding amongst the civilian population. And another important number is the number of women who were raped during the rape of Nanjing. And this was supposed to break the Chinese spirit. It was a terrible moment, but the end of the story was that the Chinese did not surrender. They kept fighting against Japan. We know about this event because we first knew about it because some Westerners, German and British, who were living in Nanjing, were able to establish a safety zone in Japan, not wanting to sort of anger Western powers too much, decided to let the safety zone exist. And so these doctors and entrepreneurs who were in the safety zone brought people who were suffering into the safety zone from elsewhere in Nanjing, and they wrote about how bad the casualties were and the Japanese atrocities were. This is a quick look here. We could talk about 1,000 cases a night that were witnessed and described by Chinese who came to this sort of beacon of light in this terrible moment. So as we look at the situation, the Japan's occupation of China over the next couple of years, this and as well as Nanjing, and so they've really made a lot of progress in their goal of taking over China. And the Empire of Japan beyond China, as the army continues to expand and move, will continue to grow. I-42 it includes all of these different territories. So I'll talk about that a bit more in a second, but I want you to get an idea of just how big Japan's empire was able to become. Their imperialism had really taken off thanks to their policies and their strong military and their quick movements. In that empire, there are some elements of benevolence and economic aid and these kinds of things, but a lot of the stories that I want to focus on today are sad stories. The Rape of Nanjing was one of those stories, but I also want to talk about killing contests, which historians are only now writing about in depth. Papers in Japan would actually report killing contests in which Japanese soldiers, usually sort of middle-ranking officers, would challenge themselves to a sort of a duel to who could kill the most Chinese soldiers. And as this article shows, the victorious one killed 106, but he was closely followed by his competitor who killed 105. So this sort of they call it the carnival of war is one of the more recent scholarly terms to talk about the spectacle of war and atrocities that Japan was committing. And so we really see that Japan has turned their anger towards the West, towards always being not good enough and racially inferior, into a drive to suppress and to take over peoples in East Asia that goes far beyond the kind of treatment that they were receiving from the West. The Japanese were also, like the Germans, very interested in how they could use empire for science. And one of the most important stories in that vein, it was the conducting of human experimentation, usually to try and find new cures, new medicines, new treatments, and new forms of understanding, but using live human subjects. And this, what we see here is actually in Manchuria today. You can go and see this site, but there was a unit that was specifically engaged in military funded experimentation on Chinese and mostly Chinese subjects. And so Ishishida was the doctor in charge of this. He is sort of the figure who is parallel to his part who involved in that experimentation. They were actually in conversation with each other about these cholera or typhoid, the Black Death, and so they were taking live subjects and giving them these kinds of diseases and trying to figure out how to cure them. They also were developing new knowledge about bacterias, the stages of pregnancy, but also trying to develop biological weapons that could be used against the West. So this was one of the things that was happening as well, especially in Manchuria, but also in Japan proper, at today's Kyushu University in Fukuoka. One of the things that was most horrifying was, again, these live subjects, some of whom were being cut alive in a process that we call vivisection. So this was another sort of the atrocities that Japan was committing as its empire continued to expand. And all the while, the empire is expanding. We have these horror stories, these atrocities. There was an effort to try and visualize an East Asia that was going to be improved by Japanese imperialism. So we have these competing narratives, right? The army has gone off the rails in 37. We have Unit 71. We have other atrocities as well. We have killing contests, etc. But back in Tokyo, a lot of the elite officials in the military and some who were also in the government had a different vision. They wanted to see Japan liberate East Asia, right, from Western imperialism, because that, it is true that the West had really crippled China several times, and they had obviously, taken over and crippled Vietnam and the whole sort of south of what used to be called French Indochina. And so they saw themselves, also British India, they saw themselves as perhaps a force that could liberate Asia as a whole from the West in these sort of elite and powerful circles. And this is also where we see the ideology of Kita Iki, which we discussed last class and the class before that, had sort of become so absorbed by military figures especially those in the capital and others, that they had sort of all come to accept that making Asia free from the West was a Japanese responsibility. So the formal sort of concrete realization of this is supposed to happen actually under the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. This is actually a new East Asian order that's sort of formalized by Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro, who you see here. And, he's a member of the imperial family. He is a politician, but also a member of the court. So he has a special sort of tie to both Japan's government, but also people of Japan. He was, a very powerful, influential figure, but who also wanted to lead Japan to being a leading country in the global order. He established a think tank to try and get industry and the government to cooperate to further Japan's technological expertise for the benefit of Japan's investments overseas and for its overseas partners. But the Great East Asian Prosperity Sphere was really all about a vision of Pan-Asianism, right? Like, we're all Asian, we've all suffered under Western oppression and imperialism, and now we're going to throw off that yoke. And Japan is going to occupy the leading spot in this new vision but if you follow us, we're going to lead you out of this. They even had a conference in 43 in which they invited countries that were trying to become independent in Asia to attend in Tokyo. And of course, the promise was that Japan would colonize, but then it would sponsor independence for these kinds of countries. But the reality, for the most part, was Japan oppressing Asian countries or Asians oppressing Asians. So Thailand, Burma, India, Philippines, these countries all actually embrace the opportunity and the promise of this East Asian co-prosperity sphere at first, right? And then they embrace the idea of not being colonized anymore by the West. And we see the Indian National Army, they welcome the Japanese when the Japanese arrive, Burma as well, and the Philippine independence movement, they all embrace the Japanese as a liberating force, which is part of how we explain the empire's quick growth, right, so quickly in the early 40s. And one thing that's important to note that I've mentioned here on my slide is that these movements, the Japanese are going to eventually be oppressive forces, but these movements that get this sort of jumpstart from the Japanese presence and their promise of independence are actually very important for the post-war anti-colonial movements that take place and eventually do achieve independence in these countries. So it's not all that, I suppose. Thinking again about the empire, the Japanese empire, the closest countries that are part of Japan's empire are really sort of funneling all of their manpower and resources to Japan to support the war effort through no real. And so this, I think, probably should have been an indicator for countries, have they known about this, of what being a Japanese imperial holding or a space would entail. So we talked about, Mr. Pak. He's part of the forced industrial work immigration program, bringing over Korean students and others to come work. We see also forced migration of Koreans in general to Japan for population, sort of, to continue, I guess, for the workforce, but also to help the population continue to grow, sustain itself. We see, that there was also a Taiwanese volunteer corps that was that we actually see here of men who were sort of encouraged to volunteer, and they actually most of the time it appears saw this as an opportunity. But what happens is they, of course, end up, having the worst jobs in the imperial army, doing all the dirty work and dying in the largest numbers as Japan's war continues to grow. Perhaps one of the most well-known and controversial elements of Japan's wartime activities are the comfort women. I think that a few weeks ago, Alexander asked if we're going to talk about this, and I do want to talk about it very briefly today. But this was a system process that the government of Japan, in an effort to sort of try and bridle the sexual urges of the Japanese military that had clearly gone off the rails, even for Japanese military figures. They were all ashamed by what happened in Nanjing. The idea was that they would be able to satisfy their sexual needs with comfort women of comfort, or ianfu in Japanese. That would allow them to not take out their sexual frustrations on innocent civilians in their various military exploits. So this is still an area of contention because we're not sure how many there were, the systems by which they were recruited. It seems to be that women were typically attracted by false occupation opportunities, and that then they were then abducted, or then tricked into becoming prostitutes. And although there were a few women of European origin, especially in the Philippines, actually in Indonesia, they were mostly, almost all Asian women, mostly from Japan's colonies, so Korea in particular, but also from China. And these women would work at comfort stations where they were, they were forced to have sex for almost no money. And we're still now trying to do the numbers, but if we're talking about 400,000 women I think is a pretty good estimate that I've seen and been able to sort of read in several different places. I think it's a good estimate. This is a very big prostitution workforce that was a kind of labor that the Japanese created for their colonial subjects. And the death rate amongst comfort women was probably somewhere around 75%. So it was a very hard life. I don't have much time to talk about this, but this is a comfort station in Shanghai, and soldiers would go and then they would rape women and they would pay them very little. And these were built just for the military to, as I said, handle their sexual needs and stop hurting the population that they were trying to take over. This is a picture of some comfort women that of various ages with some of their younger siblings in the pictures as well. This is just a really brief account from a Korean comfort woman. What I want to say before I read this is that a lot of the controversy that continues to sort of fester about this is the government has not admitted directly that this happened, and that they condoned and created the system, and there is a whole movement to deny that this ever happened, or to call the accounts exaggerative and those kinds of things. And so this is one of the women who has spoken out very clearly about her past, overcoming the shame of having been forced into prostitution for so long. This is what she talks about when she was first brought to the comfort station. So these kinds of stories, there are several great books about comfort women now that are out. If you're interested in this, for example, that's one of your topics for the, what did I call it? I think I called it like a pick and dive activities. I can help you find resources on that. So while Japan is very busy, basically taking over Asia, first as a savior and then as a colonial power, the arrival of Japan in North Vietnam, from China to North Vietnam, is sort of what sets off the West's alarms that this has gone too far. They'd already decried Japan's creation of Manchukuo as a farce, and it already tried to find ways to discourage Japan from doing more. They had ceased to work with Japan in terms of agreements about military buildup. So they were already sort of not communicating in the late 30s. But what we see is when they go into North Vietnam, France is very upset about this because this is obviously a French colony. And so the Japanese decided to get raw materials and to cut off supplies to Chiang Kai-shek, sort of shakes the West awake, and they begin to look at how they can oppose Japan and its continued growth. In 1940, Great Britain, US, Japan, and China together oppose Japan's growth. They wanted to cut off Japan's oil supply. And the condition is that Japan has to leave China and North Vietnam for them to be able to get the oil supply going again. I'm actually getting to this point here, so I'll go to this slide first. Led by President Roosevelt, the US, Great Britain, China, and the Dutch collaborate to issue embargoes that are going to forbid the export of iron and steel and oil to Japan from their holdings in the Pacific and also Indian Oceans. Japan is, Japan relies upon its oil coming. I think about 8% of Japan's oil consumed in 1940 was imported, right? So their military machine, their industries as a whole relied upon this so much. And so when this decision was made, the Japanese were very, they were very upset, and they were also unsure what to do. And this is part of what leads to the decision to make a dramatic choice, and that choice was to attack a strategic location that would show that Japan was not afraid to go to war with the West. So that is the background for Japan's choice to bomb Pearl Harbor in 1941. At the same time, as this happens, this is actually a base that's off the, it's not close to the rest of the United States. I think it was a calculated attack meant to do damage to the military, but not to the country of the United States as a whole. I think it was also a distraction, right? They at the same time bombed and then began to invade the Philippines at the same time. So it was a strategic move by the Japanese. And by late December, they'd already invaded Burma and the Philippines, making their empire even larger. And again, in both places, they are promoting this image of a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere at first. They move on to Malaysia in 42, and then, Indonesia in 42, and then they move on to Malaysia and to Singapore in 42. So in the spring. So this is the point when Japan's empire really gets to its zenith, its largest extent. And they're still initially trying to sort of promote this idea of a collaborative, uplifting kind of Japanese imperialism. When they go to these, they give out flyers that say will help you, those kinds of things. As Japan's after Pearl Harbor happens, the United States officially enters World War II. It decides to turn its attention towards Japan. And one of the interesting things that we see is that a lot of the racial prejudice that was already existing in the United States against Japanese, it explodes. And so we see the stereotypes sort of boiling over in a lot of propaganda. And what I have here, I have a German propaganda poster that you can see with a samurai smashing an American carrier. But I want to focus more on the American propaganda poster here that says, if you worked as hard and fast as a Jap, we'd smash Tokyo a lot quicker. And here we have very caricatured, mocking depiction of a Japanese worker who is working very hard, but also has traits like buck teeth and the glasses, the round glasses that are associated with sort of Japanese racist stereotypes, and also are closely tied to the lead general at this point, who is, we'll talk about him in a little bit, Tojo. So this is happening, and this is sort of creating a lot of tension between the US and Japan, perhaps even more than it had been before. There's a great book called War Without Mercy by John Dower that talks about the importance of all this sort of racialized US-Japanese propaganda in sort of fanning the flames of tension and war between the two countries. This is actually one of the American propaganda items as well that I think is interesting to look at. So here we have again sort of a Japanese military star, and then we have the buck teeth, and we have the slanted eyes, and the tail has the Hinamata, which is the Japanese flag on it. So this is a clear sort of composite of several stereotypes about the Japanese, but turning them into sort of dehumanizing them, making them into something that is a pest and is weak and can be easily defeated with the right techniques and materials. So this kind of racism was, I said before, a continuation of racism that already existed against Japanese who were taking American jobs, or so they said, who were engaged in, you know, in theory, efforts to undo the United States and to weaken the United States. So Roosevelt issues Executive Order 1966 in February, not long after Pearl Harbor, and interns 100,000 Japanese Americans who had already in the 20s lost their citizenship, and now they're put into these camps. I wish we talked about this more today, but I don't have a lot of time. What I will say is that we have not found one verified piece of evidence or proof that there was a single Japanese spy in the United States proper. So this effort really was racially motivated and racially executed. And the stories of Japanese who were interned, it's very sad. They lost their farms and their homes. When they went back to their homes, they were gone after the war was over. The government in the 80s apologized and gave them some money, which is better than nothing, I suppose. But that story is sort of a continued legacy of racism that goes back to the Japanese Americans and their work ethics and white supremacy back in the early 20th century. So now I'm going to move to what's happening with the war on the home front in Japan. The government really goes into overdrive from 37. As soon as Japan invades China and sort of invades Beijing and then begins to take over China, we see a concerted effort by the government to make the country a war machine, so in every sense of the word. The 1938 National Mobilization Law mobilizes the entire country so the government can take whatever it needs to wage the war. This could be food, it could be, they could take over factories, which they do, they could take over, farmland. And so this really, hospital space, and this turns the country into a sort of a tool for Japan's warfare overseas. And in 41, we see that children are conscripted into labor for mostly for industries that are going to be feeding the Japanese war machine. In 43, they wait a long time, but they finally also conscript women to work in factories. They tried to hold out, but they couldn't wait anymore, and they do that as well. The food control law sets up a rationing system that the government will determine food supplies and where they go and how much of food is available. And so these are some things that you'll see appearing in Barefoot again as you finish the book and work on your essays. And this is all mostly from the book, so you can go back to the book and you can look at this again, but I want to just touch on these points briefly. Talked about labor unionization happening in Japan, beginning with the UIKI in 1912 and growing into the National Labor Federation in the 1920s. What happens in 1942 is that the government takes over all the unions and forms one national trade union, the Federal Patriotic Industrial Service Union, which defeats the point of the union because now the government is in control of this body, and it uses it to sort of cultivate worker morale and to suppress dissent and to maximize output. Another important tool the government creates is the Imperial Rural Assistance Association, which I'll get to in a second. So I'm not going to mention that anymore right now. So I want to talk about a few different groups that are important in this transition from sort of a constitutional democracy to a totalitarian regime with just tremendous abilities to indoctrinate and to control thought and to arouse public support. The Imperial Military Reserve Association was founded in 1910 by an aging former member of the army. He's a general, and then he was also a minister of the army, and then as well as prime minister, Tanaka Gichi, in the 20s. But in 1910, he found this association, which is sort of a group that is aiming to pull in young men, right? Like the YMCA or like any of these groups that are trying to appeal to young men and to turn their attention towards helping serve Japan, or the Boy Scouts, for example, and to serve Japan's empire. And so they become military reservists, with badges and these kinds of things. And it begins as a very small undertaking in Tokyo, and it grows within 5 years to having 14,000 branches with over 3 million members. And what we see is that this group, this sort of not this this beginning will become, a much be very influential in Japan as we move forward. This is, for example, the group that works together to rebuild, to build, excuse me, Meiji Shrine in 1920, mostly built to celebrate the Emperor Meiji, who died in 1912, but mostly built by the hands of young men who volunteered to come do this. So this was sort of a seed that would grow into an important piece of Japan's sort of military machine in the 30s and 40s. I also want to mention some later developments. In 37, we see the National Spirit Mobilization Law, which is sort of the counterpart to, I mentioned a second ago, the National Mobilization Law. The National Spirit Mobilization Law is all about efforts to promote the right kinds of ideas, to suppress the wrong kinds of ideas, and to get schools and shrines all involved in the effort to promote, the right kind of nationalism and patriotism. We'll talk in a second about a document called Kokutei no Hongi, or the Cardinal Principles of our polity, which is a document written by the government that is sort of supposed to capture these ideals. And that was actually part of this campaign that began in 37 to mobilize Japan's national spirit for the war effort. Let's go to, so I mentioned the SAMPO, the Industrial Service Federation, and I mentioned the Industrial Service Association. So the last step of making it into one big union happened in 1940. But if you go back to this, the Imperial Military Reserves Association, 1910, using that model and its success. Now, it was a huge national success with young men all over the country taking part. Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro decides to create an Imperial Rule Assistance Association, which is going to be a massive nationwide organization with both men and women belonging to it, whose goal is to foster patriotism and to organize events, music events, plays, dances, but also to organize local community activities and oversight. And so you read in your book, In Barefoot Again, about the chairman. He was the chairman of the Imperial Rule Assistance Association for his community. So this was actually one of the many ways in which the government at the national level was able to reach into local households and local communities and exert influence and suppress dissent and promote conformity and obedience. So this is one of the events that that was put on by the Imperial IRA. In 1940, they continue to grow until 1945 and to carry out these kinds of activities. And women were very much involved as well. Women were involved sort of in the background of the IRAA, but they were also themselves involved in the Greater Japan National Defense Women's Association, which began as a group of wives of members of the army, and then the military police found this to be successful in Osaka, so they began to promote it. And 37 it becomes a national organization. It sort of becomes like the mirror or the sister organization for the Imperial Military Reserve Association, which is all young men. And this is the way that women can also show their support for Japan's military and Japan's empire. And so we see that this is a group that really mobilizes as Japan's war in China and the continent gets larger and larger, women's resources to support the war effort. Women as nurses, women with care packages, women who visit the families of deceased soldiers or injured soldiers. This whole network of women's activities blossoms from this Greater Japan National Defense Women's Association, and is again very effective. And this is, if you see women wearing this white ribbon like this in pictures, this is what they belong to that association. They also collect donations. They cook food for soldiers. They, raise money. Lots of things that are very effective. And here we see two things that they were oftentimes busy doing. They were making care packages or imobukuro, which might contain, some pencils or paint brushes for soldiers to be able to write, dry socks, sometimes some dry sundries, some dry goods that were well received. And as you can see, the men who get these in the front line, they're very happy to receive these packages that were inevitably put together by women who belong to the Greater Japan National Women's Defense Association. Also, we see they also were overseeing the 1,000 stitch belts, or called the Sinin body, which we see here. And these are basically people in the community would get together and they would each sew a stitch into this belt to show that they were thinking about the person who was on the front lines and who was fighting. And they would see this sometimes in their imabukuro, and they would also feel that they were tied back to their home, right? Their home town, city, community, etc. And the spear drills, especially after 1943, were carried out oftentimes by the Imperial Military Rule Assistance members at the local level. And women were also being taught how to use spears in preparation for the attack that was going to happen for sure by the American aggressors. And this was a very frequent activity for women as well as for young women at schools. And we have men oftentimes who had fought at some point in the military for Japan who would teach these sessions. And it became also part of their calisthenics routine. So jumping jacks and spear drills were a daily routine in Japan for the last 3 years of the war. We also see that the neighborhood associations, which I mentioned again, are tied to the Imperial Military Rule Assistance groups. These are going to become ubiquitous in Japan. People have to register with the government to be able to work. So we have more control of the government over Japanese daily lives in almost every way. You need a permit to travel outside of your hometown. There are rules about clothing. For example, this is a monpe, or it's a kind of workers' pants that women were told to wear after 43. And to make it easier for them to be active, right, and to do the spear drill and to carry out their duties as both citizens and wives and mothers. We also see things like jazz being taken out of the dictionary and yaku being substituted for baseball, and sort of trying to erase Western influence at basic level. One of the most famous and enduring legacies of the war are the Tokotai, or the kamikaze pilots. These are actually a sort of a cadre of men, young men typically, who from October 1944, when Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro decided to create this strategy, would fly an airplane with enough fuel to get to their target, and then would crash their planes into strategic military installations, usually aircraft carriers, um, uh, of the Allies, in an effort to cause maximum damage. This really comes about because the military of Japan had too few pilots left, right, to do the kind of fighting that they had prepared for over the past, 50 years. And they also didn't have enough carriers to carry skilled pilots within, a close enough range to do damage and then get back to a carrier. So they lacked resources, and the embargo of the ABCD encirclement, the American, British, Chinese death encirclement, sort of exacerbated that problem. So this was a last-ditch, but maximum efficiency strategy the Japanese carried out, and the age of these pilots begins to drop, and they are in their teens by the end, and it is oftentimes those who are drafted, not those who are officers who've gone to school, who are sort of the ones who are the first to be forced to do this. So I'm going to finish quickly that the war comes to an end. The first Prime Minister, Kone Fumimaro, who at this point is no longer Prime Minister. The Prime Minister right now is actually Tojo, who we'll see in a second. He is sure that Japan needs to end this war. Japan is losing. I didn't go through all the different battles, in Saipan and Midway. Midway is the turning point for the war. That Japan is losing the war on the sea, and it's clear that Japan is going to be invaded by the Allied powers, the U.S. being at the front of those powers. He writes a memorial in which he argues that Japan should avoid foreign attack, unrest from below in Japan, and revolutionary plans from sort of some plotting officials by surrendering to the West, but he is not listened to. So Tojo Hideki, who we see here, was general for most of Japan's war with the West. He's followed by Koiso Kuniaki and by Admiral Suzuki Kantaro. The most important name to remember for the future, because he is still the most important figure even after he is no longer prime minister. The war comes to an end actually quite abruptly with the arrival of the U.S. military in Okinawa in March of 45. That begins the end of the war. So they are very successful. I think there are about 30,000 casualties on the Japanese side, but this is the first time they're actually on land in Japan proper, and they'll move from there onwards to take over the rest of Japan. In May, Germany surrenders to a Russian and American delegation, ending their part in World War II. And so one of Japan's only real strong allies, and sort of their anchor in the Western world during this war, it folds. Just before that, the US military firebombs Tokyo, like this, destroying Tokyo. Probably about 100,000 lives were lost during this firebombing. So this was a great tragedy for the capital, and it was meant to show Japan that they should stop fighting. And of course, we talked about the spear drills, and then there were also efforts by Japanese diplomats to communicate with American diplomats about how to end the war. But each time, these messages took a long time to formulate and to decode, and the Japanese had not agreed to stop fighting when the next steps were taken. Sorry, I'm going to show you, this is a bit of a graphic image of the firebombing and what happens to people when on the Capitol. Okay, I'm going to skip that. In 45, in July, Russia and Great Britain and the United States agreed to a declaration in Potsdam near Berlin that Japan has to surrender unconditionally to the Allied powers, has to agree to allow foreign troops to occupy it, has to renounce all claims on its colonies overseas, and it has to allow its leaders and soldiers to be tried as war criminals. And people would need to be the ones to choose the new government that would be in place. And if not, Japan would face prompt destruction. And it is to this message that Japan is unable to respond to in a clear way and quick enough way that allows President Truman at this point to decide to drop the first and the second atomic bomb, only to ever drop on any people in the world. The first on August 6th, the little boy dropped by Paul Tibbets, who we see here waving as he takes off. Dropping little boy on Hiroshima, which is an important industrial center for the military, and then Fat Man, the other bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, another important port in near, as you know, near in Kyushu. These two lead to 200,000 deaths approximately, and then hundreds of thousands of other deaths over the next 10 years. And the away tasting metallic aftertaste of the explosion on their tongues. So this has been a really quick overview of the 15-year war, focusing on 37 to 45. We can talk about some of these things more in depth if you'd like to next class on Tuesday. But you have some background that you need here, and you can also go back to the book and if you need to and check, get more information. So I'm going to stop there for today. Thank you for listening to this very compact lecture, and I hope you all have a good afternoon, and be sure to look for the new due date, which is Tuesday at 2:30 for your essays. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I had a question, Professor.
Yes, Sam.
Yeah. In one of the propaganda posters you showed of the Japanese as lice, I noticed that the tail has the flag on it, but the forehead of the monster in question basically had a star. Do you know what that represented? Because I kind of was like, well, it's kind of like a U.S. symbol, for the Navy was the star, on their planes, but there's a star very similar to it on it.
I actually used to know, but I've forgotten, so I don't know. I have to look it up. I know that there is some sort of a military correlation for the Japanese military, but I don't know what that is. So I will. I mean, you probably if you look it up, if you look up the star, you might find some things about that. But I've forgotten why that matters.
All right, no problem.
I might look it up, but I probably won't have time.
It's okay. All right, thank you. Have a good.
Sam.
I'll see you in a little bit.
All right. See you in a bit.
I have a question about the discussion sections tomorrow. So I saw on the